inglés, lo siento, pero aquí todos mis slides están en español y hay un bit.ly link si quieres repasar mis slides, cada día después de hoy. Yo no sé. Thanks you so much for being here today. I know it's been a very, very long 2 days, but a very exciting 2 days. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this chat, which I've titled El Efecto Mariposa de Python. First, I want to decir una palabra de gracias. My team that came with me from GitHub, if you can stand up so I can shamelessly point you out. Come on, Andre. No, Andre is not here. I see you, Ale. Thank you. When I told my team that I was going to be speaking at PyCon Latam, I was met with excited, ¿cómo podemos ayudar? And then this incredible group of people came together to talk about the really exciting stuff that they're doing to bring not only better tooling through GitHub to you, but to also meet our community in a language that reflects the languages that they speak in. And if you have any questions about the GitHub Learning Labs, you really ought to chat with the team that's here. They're a great group of people, and I'm so thankful to have their support. So, as you may have heard, hola, me llamo Lorena Mesa. I take a lot of selfies like this, hence like the ones I was doing up here earlier. And if you haven't guessed, I'm a little bit in love with Python. I do a few things with Python en la comunidad. Por ejemplo, estoy usando Python en mi trabajo con GitHub. I am an organizer with PyLady Chicago, and I'm also a director with the Python Software Foundation. And I have no idea how to say vice chair. This is something that Naomi and I have gone back and forth about so many times, and I keep joking that we just need a big ornamental ceremonial chair we carry her around in. So I don't know, maybe I get a small one. If you have any questions about anything you want to talk after the fact, on most places in the internet, you can find me at lorena@pyladies.com, lorena@github.com, lorena@python.org. You kind of get the idea. And I'm pretty active on social. My Twitter and Instagram handle is really obnoxious. It's Lorena Nicole. Definitely was inspired because I was watching un partido de fútbol a few years ago, and when that amazing goal came on, for me, when I say the World Cup, I'm talking about La Copa Mundial Femenina, because to me, World Cup, it's women. So that, that's just the truth. But I was watching a very exciting match when I decided to rebrand my handle. So I mentioned I'm from Chicago. And those of you who are here and that live in all the beautiful places, some folks that I've met from Panama, from Nicaragua, from Argentina, and of course from here, Mexico, your weather is very different, I imagine, than our weather here in Chicago. But at the same time, I'm going to say it's actually a little similar. The last few days here in Puerto Vallarta, yes, it's been beautiful, but also like I wake up in the middle of the night and it's like a tsunami feeling kind of like outside. Luckily, the hotel has taught us how to respond in the case of a tsunami. I have learned to not look at the wildlife when a tsunami is about to strike, because apparently it pulls back the water and you can actually look down. So I was like, today I learned. But unlike here in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, in Chicago, our winters get very, very extreme. So as you can see here, there are some terrifying images, and I imagine some of you are like, I am never going to Chicago based on these images. But this past year in January 2019, we actually had what was called a polar vortex. So going from a la izquierda a la derecha, we have the sky, an aerial view of the skyline frozen over. We've got this like beautifully but kind of disturbing frozen, almost doorway that's been created. And then top right to bottom, outside, people actually had to wear ski attire to protect your entire face. That image in the middle there on the right-hand side, yes, the train tracks were put on fire to keep them from freezing and to keep functioning, and then kind of this hauntingly beautiful skyline with the mist just kind of floating around. So, when I started thinking a little bit about what I wanted to talk about, I was thinking about, kind of these bigger patterns in the world, and, my 2019 began with the polar vortex. So if you are not sure what a polar vortex is, it's basically a very large pocket of cold air, and normally this cold air is situated in the northern hemisphere above the North Pole. However, this past January 2019, a severe cold wave rolled in because there was a weakened jet stream around the Arctic polar vortex, which basically meant a bunch of air was pushed down, and I was lucky enough to be in Chicago to experience it. In understanding a bit more of the systemic impact of this change, there is a little bit of some more fun stuff that happened in the polar vortex. Don't worry, you don't necessarily need to know about the audio, but there was some interesting things happening, and we'll see if this loads. Perfect. So there was people actually going outside with boiling water, flinging it in the air, and it literally just turned instantly to snow. So yeah, very, very extreme. It's interesting how, we're in this world that's so interconnected that a change somewhere far away that I don't understand had such a big systemic impact on my life living in Chicago. On January 30th, 2019, with the wind chill factor, it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in LA versus Chicago. Temperatures got as low as -23 Fahrenheit, -30 Celsius, which was just above the city's lowest ever reading in January 1985. To even just add more nuance to it, if you look at some of these visualizations that talk about this wind pattern and basically the global impact of this weakened jet stream and how it was pushed down into Canada and the United States, this graphic was created by Joshua Stevens of the NASA Earth Observatory to show us a little bit how truly we are very globally connected, and one way we are globally connected is through weather patterns. So why am I talking about this? I'm not trying to terrify you and say, please don't come to Chicago, but to me, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say today about Python, I was reminded of this phrase that I've heard before, the butterfly effect. So the phrase that we have up here on this screen, el batir de las alas de una mariposa puede provocar un huracán en otra parte del mundo. Kind of ironic because there's actually like a hurricane system that's brewing right now in the Atlantic. This idea that we're all kind of connected, this phrase, the butterfly effect, really gets to the heart of thinking about our interconnectivity. So let's break that down a bit more. The butterfly effect comes to us from chaos theory, a mathematical discipline that analyzes the behavior of systems where we use time, or rather a function of time, to describe what potential future states will evolve. That is, whatever's happening in the current moment today, as we observe through what we call time, what happens in that moment is going to either render some future state possible or impossible. Actually, the butterfly effect is based on this thing called the Lorentz attractor. I was kind of laughing because it's like an off by one letter from Lorena and Lorentz. I'm like, we're all connected. But, so this visualization actually can appear to look like a butterfly, hence where we get that misnomer of the butterfly effect. But what exactly is this mathematical attractor? Let's think about it in a different way. Let's think about an example with a clock pendulum. So here we have on the screen an example of two types of pendulums. A pendulum being where a weight is suspended from a pivot so it can freely swing left to right over and over. At any given point, a function of time can dictate the future state of that pendulum, rendering some pathways possible and others impossible. For example, when the pendulum sits at rest, it theoretically can swing either direction. However, when it swings one direction, it makes the likelihood of swinging back the other direction less likely if the momentum is currently feeding the way that it's swinging. The other example here of a pendulum kind of gives us a little bit of a different idea to think about all these different permutations of where that pendulum is swinging through. But again, it's that experience of a time that allows us to understand how these dynamic systems are changing. So back to the Lorentz attractor. In the 1970s, mathematician Ed Lorentz was studying the formation of clouds with various computational techniques. These approaches focused on the movement of fluids in the atmosphere, primarily focusing on differential equations that looked at fluid flow in 3 dimensions, as demonstrated on the right-hand side. By applying the 4th-order Runge-Kutta routine, Lorentz was able to discover that he could actually model the formation of these dimensions in clouds over time. Even more surprising was that the set of the initial values could be plotted into geometric shapes known as the Lorentz attractor, or what we call today the butterfly effect, that visualization that we see here on the left-hand side. So taking this idea a step further and thinking about interconnectivity, how can we take the butterfly effect, this idea, and apply it to human systems? What would we find if we were to kind of understand if we were to think about modeling interconnectivity with a function of time? One example that we can think about is the movement of peoples. So, for example, maybe instead of having butterfly wings, we could say, what happens when people are moving between geographic units that we may call, let's say, Mexico y los Estados Unidos de América. For us to kind of think about it, we can represent some of these with visualizations. And by the way, if you're ever looking for inspiration for places of how to think about doing some cool and compelling visualizations, I highly recommend to check out Data is Beautiful. It is a subreddit, and there's another one called Data is Ugly, should you want to not be inspired by some failures. But let's go ahead and take a little bit of a look at thinking about human systems like movement. So we've got 2 visualizations, and don't worry, I don't expect you to read all of those details, but what I kind of want you to think about is how these visualizations are breaking down the complexity of human movement. And what we have here on the left-hand side is a visualization brought to us by Guy Abel, Nicole Sander, and Ramon Bayer, using data from 1990 to 2010. You're actually able to filter between buckets of 5 years, and then you can actually click between different countries to see the net population moving out and net population moving in. So for example, if we click in, you actually start with regional areas. So before this view, you would have one that says North America and one that says Latin America. You could click in and you'd be able to see that from Latin America into specifically Mexico to the United States from 2005 to 2010, approximately 2 million people net positive moved into the United States, a loss of 2 million from Mexico. Another visualization, which is pretty interesting, is actually called People Movin', and it's the URL peoplemov.in. It's pretty nifty. It's HTML5 powered. But rather than having that representation with these interactive circles, what we have instead are plottable lines that we're able to kind of break down net traffic between all countries, and it actually gives us some more demographics as well. All that to say that when I was thinking about an inspiration for this talk and thinking about human systems and human movements, it really struck me that I was going to be speaking in Mexico, specifically because my father's family is from Mexico. So shown here on the left-hand side is some members of my beautiful family. From the left is my abuelo, Romas, the guy to the next of him in a really, really tacky Christmas suit. That's my papa, Enrique. Kiki, he's cool. My abuela, Magdalena. Mi sobrina, Ziggy. We call her Zigzag. It's real cute. And then mi hermana, Erin. So the movement of my family, if I'm thinking about this a bit more, the origin of my family is actually quite complex, and I think I've talked with some people here a little bit about how I came to be in Chicago, but I'm just going to drill into a part of that story. So specifically, la familia de mi abuelo, they're right from right here on the border in this town called Piedras Negras. They're from this town called Piedras Negras. So it's interesting because when I talk with my abuelo about memories that he has from Piedras Negras, he always talks about Piedras Negras as a little village, a little puebloito, which obviously is not the case today because it's about 163,000 people in the city and then 245,000 folks in the metro area. However, when the city was founded in 1850, the name Piedras Negras is actually inspired from the large coal deposits that were found in the immediate area. And actually in 1881, that led to the discovery of large coal deposits actually led to a booming railroad industry. That actually then elevated the status of this villa to una ciudad que se llama Porfirio Díaz until 1911, because as we all know, things kind of changed in Mexico after the fall of Díaz. All that to say, though, that my family is from a very interesting part situated right between two countries. Some of the other stories that my abuela would talk to me about, they're a bit interesting. In fact, he would start telling me about stories of the town, of the old man in the village who would come down from the mountains to steal the town virgins. I have no idea what he's talking about because as far as I can tell, the closest set of mountains, Sierra del Carmen, if you even try on Google Maps to be like, how do I get there? They're like, there's no route. So I don't know what they're talking about when we're talking about an old man coming and stealing town virgins. I don't know why that's the memory I was given. In fact, I actually do think this might be from my abuelo and I's mutual obsession with telenovelas, and there might be some of you laughing in here because I have a deep obsession with telenovelas. In fact, I do a talk about deep learning generating telenovelas, but that's a story for another time. So anyways, this example here of Rosalinda, which I know that my abuelo loves very much, it's kind of interesting because the story, our main character, Thalia, she marries her love, Fernando Jose, as you can see from their loving but skeptical and kind of strange look right there. He eventually leaves her because his stepmother-in-law says that the mother of his love actually murdered his father. Turns out then Rosalinda is pregnant, premature labor happens. Oh, and her baby Erika is kidnapped. Notice the connection, kidnapped. The baby is kidnapped and she loses her memory. So I don't know. I'm just gonna say maybe my abuelo was inspired by some of his telenovela loves because I didn't really find anything like very interesting about kidnappings happening specifically around you being a virgin and being dragged to the mountains. So all that to say, another thing though that's really interesting to me though that I really can remember and I think is very compelling to me in thinking a little bit about my identity is I always remember my abuelo telling me, Lore, no nos movimos, la frontera se movió. Let's break that down a little bit. Another thing that I was also taught very early in life, Lorena, nunca olvide el Tratado de Guadalupe Hidalgo. I was like being trained to be like an activist since I was apparently very young. Talking about the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, as we know, because we're on the other side of that war, the landscape of Mexico changed quite a bit. Specifically in 1846, the United States, having a strong fervor for expansionism, invaded Mexico. Why? I don't know, because that was a thing they decided to do. We're not talking about privilege necessarily in this story, but there's a lot of privilege there. In the continuing of this expansionist campaign, the United States folks landed in Veracruz, eventually took the capital, and then by February 1848, the war comes to a close with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In theory then, changing the border between Mexico and the United States, specifically where my family has been based, and hence my abuelo always telling me, Lorena, we didn't move, the border moved on us. A very famous Chicana poet, a feminist, a scholar, describes the US-Mexico border through this imagery of it as an open wound. Specifically, she goes on to say, this herida abierta, this open wound, is graded again and again, and it opens and bleeds, and before a scab can form, it hemorrhages again. forming a third space, a border, a place to distinguish us from them. So I apologize a little bit for the resolution. I was trying to get a better one. A lot of my family complexity is quite involved. Just digging into the family story of the Mesa side of my heritage, it's interesting to really see this strong sense of we didn't move, the border moved on us. It's something external that happened out there that's influencing our world, our life, how we live it, impacting our sense of authority and independence. In breaking down more, it's on the left-hand side, the Mesas. At the bottom, Roma es mi abuelo. In very small print, says married Magdalena, my abuela. And then you'll notice two children over, Francisca, which is my padrina. And then she married Ezequiel Mesa. She married Ezequiel Fernandez, mi padrino. So that part of the family actually then became the nucleus, a brother, sister, Mesa Fernandez, Fernandez Mesa. That became the new core of the family and started looking elsewhere to find opportunity. In talking with some folks about, why Chicago? Why is this the place that your family chose? The actual history of the Latin community in Chicago is quite long and quite interesting. Remember how I mentioned that in Piedras Negras there was that discovery of coal deposits and we then got that railroad track industry? Well, the Midwest, where I am born and raised, connecting the East and the West Coast, that's become a big area for commerce. And how did you get from one side to the other? Railroads. So after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, what we see happen in Chicago is a huge outreach for Mexican migrants to come in to work on the railroad industry in Chicago, dubbed the traqueros. That population grew and grew, and actually there was some folks that knew my family that started saying, come to Chicago, there is opportunity. So again, these kind of small actions in the aggregate and the idea of modeling human systems, we find time and time again, it's small movements that in the aggregate actually that can have big impact. In speaking more about the traqueros, what's interesting is that because there was such a large population boom in such a short time, Chicago did not have adequate infrastructure to maintain ample housing for folks. So what we see is the kind of do-it-yourself mentality popping up in Chicago with the Mexican migrant population actually refitting boxcars, railroad boxcars into makeshift homes, and actually then being situated in areas in Chicago like back of the yards. So if anyone has ever heard of the book, The Jungle, which is a pretty groundbreaking publication in the early 19th century talking about labor conditions, not even so much just labor conditions in the United States, but this is coinciding with the broader movement of labor rights in the world. Chicago was pretty prominent early on in some of these discussions around starting unions, thinking about collective rights, and kind of inspiring some of this consciousness, which we make today called socialismo, communism, however you may think of it. Back of the yards, while originally more of a popular destination for Eastern European heritage folks, by the time we get to the 1960s, 1970s, this is actually a very prominent area for the Latinx community in Chicago. So I've taken you from 1881 in Piedras Negras to Chicago by way of the railroads to now back of the yards and starting to talk about Chicago's South Side. And when we talk about the South Side, pretty much from the 32nd Ward down south, we'll start saying is the South Side. So in Chicago, come the 1980s, we were a community in change. Specifically here, what we have are two key events. On the left-hand side, an image taken from the closing of Wisconsin Steel, and on the right-hand side, the election of Chicago's first black mayor, Harold Washington. Fun fact, Washington, that surname. So I grew up in Humboldt Park, specifically at the Puerto Rican community in Chicago. And one of my next door neighbors, Luis Gutierrez, a very outspoken former congressman talking a lot about immigration and issues that impact the Latinx community in los Estados Unidos. His daughter is named Jessica. Her middle name, Washington. These are people that I grew up with right next door to me. So fun fact, that's where that middle name comes from. But all that to say, the landscape was shifting in Chicago, steel mills were closing, and this was a larger symbol that manufacturing was leaving Chicago, and that steady employment was not really something available. So Chicago's place as a sanctuary city, as an initial revolving door city for people to come and find opportunity, is starting to shift. And as we know, when there's not good economic opportunity, those most vulnerable, those deemed the other, are the first ones to be labeled and made a mockery of. So, want to know something else interesting? So the closing of the steel mills, which impacted largely the Chicago South Side, Chicago is actually a historically a community which is very, very segregated in terms of the geography. You have most of the Latinx population and the Black population in the South Side or the Southwest Side. The Northwest Side, the more affluent areas, is where you're going to have more of your historically white areas. So on 106th Street, which is where the steel mill closed, the Calumet Community Religious Conference was formed by the Catholic Church to assist the laid-off steel workers on the Southwest Side. With the writing on the wall that things were changing, as I mentioned, manufacturing leaving, Chicago was starting to face some challenges. So what were some responses that the community took? Well, you see, the Developing Communities Project, which is an urban offshoot of the CCRC, that is the program helping the laid-off steel mill workers, in 1985, they hired this young man who had a fun name, the name Barack Obama. Fresh out of university, Barack Obama was actually inspired to come to Chicago because of the election of the first Black mayor in Chicago. Specifically talking about this choice, he said, to me, I wanted to be in a place where I could see and understand activism, understand labor movements, and actually see people of color in charge of their destiny. So moving forward, why again am I talking about this history? Because this is where I actually got my start as a person who became involved with the Python community. It is a bit of a long way to say that in some ways I'm feeling the el efecto Mariposa. That's something 100 years ago that inspired my family to move, that inspired, the result of an expansionist war that rebranded this area of the other and made life more and more difficult for folks living there. All of that to get us to a place where we were hungry and we really wanted to see change in our community, and that being led really by this movement that we can say is characterized by the Obama presidency and the campaign. So in 2009, yes, 2009, wow, that's 10 years ago, I graduated from university with a degree in Ciencias Políticas. So I do not have a computer science degree. I actually was starting to get involved in the campaign because my university was just north of downtown Chicago, and everywhere you looked around you, you were seeing people demanding and begging and wanting change. And if there's anything to be said about the 2008 Obama campaign, is that, as Arianna Huffington says up on the right-hand side, had it not been for the internet, we wouldn't have had Barack Obama as a candidate. Had we not had the internet, he would not have even been the nominee. So why is this important? Well, the use of such technology like social media was instrumental in this campaign. In fact, I was doing data science work before there was even a word for data science in Wikipedia. Fun fact. What does that mean that we were using data science? Well, back to that sign, Latinos for Obama, a lot of this was used for customized outreach and messaging, understanding issues that impacted communities. GOTV stands for Get Out the Vote. All of these being digitally informed campaigns. And when I started getting introduced to Python, I was at the place where my math skills couldn't scale up to the amount of data that I needed to work with, so I had to turn somewhere to start using technical tools to help me actually become a multiplier. And that's where I started getting introduced into Python. As many of you have all seen here, we've had some really fantastic talks about the ways that Python is used in web development, in data analysis, and all these things. Just like how diverse Python is, data science involves a team of people with different skill sets. So the Venn diagram of not truthness on the left-hand side saying that you're a unicorn that needs all these skills. That's obviously not true. Where I started to become involved was I was coming from the area of being a political organizer and then backing in and starting to figure out, well, knowing that I know the problem firsthand, how can I find the data and check that data to build the solutions that I want to build? After my time in undergrad, I actually ended up becoming a political consultant in Chicago, doing anything and everything from running fundraisers, being a campaign manager, acting as a chauffeur on occasion. These are two examples of clients I worked with, including Alderman Michael Chandler of the 24th Ward and Alderman Roberto Maldonado of the 26th Ward. What I was finding, though, is that sense of impact that I had so come to love and find empowering from the campaign was falling a little short. What I ended up doing instead was finding myself getting increasingly pulled into open source. So I mentioned before that Chicago, my home, is a very diverse city, but also one with problems, including, as I mentioned, the segregation. While we might not have laws that say if you're this kind of person, you live there, socioeconomic indicators make it hard for change, and it means that there are certain communities that are left behind. Specifically, one area that has been problematic in Chicago has been policing. When looking at some problems with policing in Chicago, one thing that had become obvious was that there was a lot of data missing around people being arrested, and it was largely people arrested that are people of color. They would disappear for hours on end, over 24 hours, and we didn't know where they were. So I, along with some other people, started using our data skills to actually start figuring out what could we do to bring this problem to light. In the United States, there's something called the Freedom of Information Act, and you can request information time and time again, and you might sometimes get it back in a format that makes sense. Sometimes you get back nonsense. It is a very frustrating process, to say at the least. But all of us motivated by wanting to help to say that we can do policing better and that we should not be scared of our police. We teamed up with the Chicago Justice Project, and we teamed up with The Guardian to actually have this groundbreaking expose, which led to a lawsuit. And one of the things now that I've become very, very steadfast on is understanding what does it mean to create responsible technology in the world. How do we think about it? Because this is too important for us not to think about. So the idea of moving into open source and finding empowerment there led me to think, okay, maybe I don't necessarily need to actually work as a political consultant, actually work as a political analyst. Maybe I can bring about change in a different way. Interestingly, as I began my career as an engineer, because I had that experience working with social media, working with data from social media, I actually ended up working at an organization that built on top of the social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, analytics and tools. I sat on the data science team, and my issues continued. The organization that I worked with, while they were not explicitly named in this ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, they are kind of a watchdog. They observe to make sure that if there are problems in the world, that someone is stepping up and watching out. They brought about this lawsuit against Chicago Police Department for their unconstitutional use of social media monitoring and tracking software. A partner that we teamed up with at my last organization actually was listed in this lawsuit. They would bundle our software in with a whole bunch of others and sell us to big companies. So when you start reading that the tools that you're making are enabling the police department to do things like follow hashtags like Black Lives Matter, follow hashtags talking about ICE raids, ICE being the organization that oversees immigration in the United States. It's a huge conflict of interest for me. That is not what I think when I think about making responsible technology in the world. I strongly believe that if you want to bring change into the world, be the change that you want and make it happen. So I ended up leaving and quitting, kind of rage quitting my last job. All of this to say that also in the backdrop of Chicago, there was a very, very large discussion going on about police brutality and issues that just were mounting and mounting. Specifically, there was a very disturbing case caught on camera from a police dashboard where a young black man was shot not once, not twice, not 10 times, but 13 times. A very, very raw and real conversation about policing and how do we use technology to protect ourselves, or how are we not? The work that I was doing was actually making this problem worse. So this is kind of what I felt like in that moment. This is a photo taken from CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, when called in front of the US Senate Intelligence Committee to say, what were you doing? Why did Facebook have these issues and leak data that had pronounced impacts on the 2016 presidential campaign? The way I was thinking about this, could I be called up and be asked to be held accountable for the things I was doing? Am I brave enough to actually turn that lens around and look at myself? So my journey that I've talked about that's taken us from Mexico to Chicago to a political campaign back now to Python, I implore us to think about, if we take this idea of the butterfly effect, this idea of interconnectivity and understand the impacts of our actions through a function of time, what can we see in Python? Some of the ways that we can think about this, and I do actually have a little Jupyter notebook. Everything is linked here, but for the sake of time, I will just stick with the fixed images. If we were to think about the butterfly effect, with those of us who are data scientists or machine learning folks in the room, we know that we can write code to run simulations n number of times to understand change over time, correct? This is just a small little toy example, but in this example, it's like, here's my interests, and here are hypothetical people I'm interacting with some really, really naive ideas of saying, I'm going to simulate how my interest in these topics change over time. We can start to actually say, well, yeah, we do actually start to find things that are measurable. We can actually start talking about things that we know change as a product of, let's say, movement of peoples. So in that simulation here, just as an example to talk about the butterfly effect, what we have is just this hypothetical example that over the course of a year, based on the people I interact with and the bias they have towards certain interests or not, over time, this could be an example of how my interests change. So in thinking about Python and thinking about how it is that our community is changing, there's a lot to be said. A lot of really exciting things, but also some other things to pay attention to. In 2017, Stack Overflow, which is my best friend, 2017 on their blog, they talked about the surprising and incredible growth of Python. Obviously, for those of you here in the room, to us, it's not so incredible. We know that there are things that have actually inspired this radical growth and change. What are some examples? Well, let's think about the broad use cases of Python. For example, we had yesterday in the keynote with Tanya Allard talking about the evolution of this work called research software engineering and how it is that you could use Python in this space. Or we have another talk from Fernanda Ochoa talking about IoT adventures. So again, using Python with embeddable devices. Again, Python has a lot of use cases. It's not only just the broad use cases of Python that is responsible for some of this interesting growth, but also it's the ease of use. We had Naomi Cedar talk about some of the ways that exception handling is quite clear, and it's better to ask forgiveness than it is permission. And then, of course, all of us here are here because we love using Python, a language that is open source. On the right-hand side, a very cool thing that it comes out now on an annual basis is the Python Developer Survey. In 2008, this Python Developer Survey put on by JetBrains starts talking about the ways that people use Python. While the image here is probably a little hard to read because it's small and the colors aren't the best for reading from afar, let me pull out some interesting stats. What they did was collect stats on two usage patterns, one being Python, your primary language to use, the second meaning you use Python and some other language, but you use Python in a secondary capacity. Things that all bubble to the top. 58% of users who use Python as a primary language are using it for data analysis. 52% of people using Python for primary use are using it for web development. 45% DevOps, 38% machine learning. So truly, we do have, the numbers are proving that all of our use cases are quite varied, and that we as technologists are coming in and trying to create meaning out of things that may not intrinsically have meaning, and we're using Python as a conduit in order to make that happen. So it's not just that Python is a language that allows us to do this, it is the actual people who use it, and that is a very exciting thing. In thinking about the ways that we support our open source community, the Python Software Foundation has a fantastic grants program that gives out money that helps us support us doing events like PyCon Latam. As you can see from the 2019 impact report, which has stats on the previous year, the spread of grant money allocated is on a global basis. You will see South America at 15%, North America at 25%, Africa at 26%, et cetera, et cetera. So we truly do have a global population of folks. In fact, the amount of money that has been given out to support the community has grown by 22.6% and has been used in 51 countries around the world. So it's not just that the uses of Python are global and spread. It's not just that the uses of Python solve all kinds of problems, but it's literally even shaping the ways in which we think about ourselves as people. As a self-proclaimed space nerd, I really was taken back by being able to view an image of the black hole, first one ever taken, and actually having Python with a big, heavy hand in creating this image. Such tools as NumPy, SciPy, Pandas, et cetera. If you want to know more about that process, Dr. Katie Bowman has a fantastic TEDx talk, which I do actually have linked, images have links to, that you can click into. But yes, Python is actually changing how we think about ourselves and how we think about ourselves in the broader world and the broader cosmos. I was recently at PyCon Africa, another regional Python conference, and this also was in its first year. On the left-hand side here, we have an image of the mausoleum of the founding father of Ghana, and this is his mausoleum for him and his wife. Ghana is quite a beautiful place, and one of the people who truly made this come to life is this fantastic human right here, Marlene, who is our first director from Africa. Specifically, she's based in Zimbabwe. And looking at the spread of folks who came out for this conference, we have 17 countries included, 320 attendees. It was interesting to kind of actually hear them talk about this at the conference, because they were discovering new people that were from different countries when they made this announcement. So indeed, our community is coming from us from everywhere. And one of the things that was so interesting to me to hear about was this experience of movement, the movement of peoples, the movement of ideas, how this openness is really changing how we can all become power brokers and power enablers. A specific talk that shook me to my core delivered from one of the folks that helped found AfroPython, Felipe de Moraes. I'm sorry I don't speak Portuguese. I probably butchered his name, but talking about the experience of diaspora and how diaspora, like another word we can say perhaps for the butterfly effect, really impacts us all. So I ask you all, what is the impact that it is that you want to make? Is it going to be that you're creating bold new solutions in your community? Is it that you're going to be building community? Is it that maybe you are innovating and working in a field that doesn't yet exist in Wikipedia? All that to say that when we think about the butterfly effect, we need to think about how we can balance these things. So if we're thinking about how it is that we can use Python, for example, a struggle that I've had was what do I hold myself to when I'm not following the ethics that I claim to uphold? Do I aspire to do better and remember my empathy, or do I fall back and say, well, it pays the bills? On one of my last days in Ghana, I made a trip out to Cape Coast to see the slave castles. A very, very, very sombering experience. The slave castles specifically were places where captured Africans were brought and held for months on end before a ship would come and a Portuguese or British or another European colonizer would come and bring you into what we call the New World, which is Latin America, and also the United States and North America, more broadly speaking. This placard really stuck with me because when we think about systems and we think about how our impacts in the aggregate really do have change, and we may not see that change for 100 years, or it may be coming to you as a weird story about an old man kidnapping town virgins, and you're like, what are you talking about? It is really profound how our decisions can make change. So here in the Python space, I implore you all to think about what it is, what change do you want to see in the world, and how can you bring that about? I thank you so much for going on me with this journey. If you do have any questions, I'm always happy to chat. I do a bit of Spanglish. Sometimes you need to help me with my Spanish, but I thank you so much. It has been an honor.